Welcome to my presentation on an integrated approach to trauma-informed practices with the incarcerated population. What we will be covering today is trauma-informed practices in the classroom environment, an integrative treatment approach which will include cognitive processing therapy, growth mindset, motivational interviewing, dialectical behavior therapy, art therapy, and finally, forgiveness and reconciliation. I wanted to start the presentation with a quote from the book Just Mercy. Stevenson writes, "Deep in the hearts of many condemned and incarcerated people, the scattered traces of hope and humanity, seeds of restoration that come to astonishing life when nurtured by very simple interventions." And it's those interventions that we'll be talking about. My work is with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and I thought I'd start out with their mission statement, and it's to facilitate the successful reintegration of the individuals back to their communities, equipped with the tools to be drug-free, healthy, and employable members of society by providing education, treatment, rehabilitative and restorative justice programs, all in a safe and humane environment. It is because of that mission statement that gives me the rationale for the work that I do and the ideas presented here today. Trauma is an inevitable product of the sheer fact of being incarcerated. But to better serve this population and to reduce the impact of trauma, staff must address these issues and be aware of them. Staff training needs to take place for trauma-informed care, and it needs to be at the center of all interactions with offenders. Some statistics I'd like to provide you with that also gives the rationale for the benefit of education in the correctional setting. In 2004, the UCLA Board of Public Policy and Social Research stated that $1 million spent on correctional education can prevent about 600 crimes. Furthermore, that same money invested in incarceration prevents only 350 crimes. Correctional education is almost twice as cost-effective as crime control policy. A few more statistics from the Bureau of Justice. In 2006, 76% of jail offenders and 74% of state prisoners and 63% of federal prisoners are reported as having mental disorders. 49% of jailed offenders and 42% of state prisoners have both a mental and substance abuse disorder. The report also showed that 30% of juveniles display co-occurring disorder. I wanted to start this presentation for trauma-informed strategies for the classroom simply because this is starting to be a conversation that's being had in correctional education settings, and so this part of it is starting to be looked at and it is well received, and so I wanted to start at this point. The 4 R's of trauma-informed educational practices is a good place to start, and they're easy to remember. First, to realize about trauma and how it affects people. Second, recognize the signs of trauma. Third, respond. It's important to have a system in place that responds to trauma. And lastly, resisting re-traumatization. My teachers usually ask me for practical things that they can do in their classroom. So these are some strategies that are important. Behavior, look beyond, but don't ignore it. The trauma brain is altered and can affect students socially, emotionally, behaviorally, and academically. Building relationships is key. Creating a safe environment. Meet students where they are and be predictable. Characteristics that you might see in a classroom is fighting back, fleeing, freezing, physical violence, or just refusing assistance or refusing to participate. Dismissing feedback, breaking classroom rules, being distracted because flashbacks, fear, may look as if they are off task or exhibiting haphazard thinking. Students might appear zoned out or even fall asleep in class as a means of escaping. Some important benefits of having a trauma-informed classrooms are it fosters predictability, builds sense of stability for students, cultivates self-worth, and gives students an opportunity in a safe environment that's predictable to regulate their emotions and improve their focus. Some more classroom strategies that are useful: offer choices. Many times in the correctional environment, there are very few choices, but when there can be a choice, offer it. Getting on the same page. This is a part of active listening. Help them to be able to process information by giving them feedback about what you hear. Lastly, be fair. There could be consequences or interventions that need to be had, but be fair. They should be matched with the student's behavior. Learning and cognition can be greatly affected by trauma, and this can be exhibited in difficulty processing interactions, decreased attention, focus, memory, reduced executive functioning, difficulty solving problems, difficulty understanding the consequences of actions. A common concern for teachers is the behaviors that are exhibited in their classroom. And it's very easy to react. And I would like to offer these suggestions. Have clear expectations for what you expect. Talk about them. They might need to be repeated and gone over a number of times. Have a process for addressing behavioral concerns that students understand. Lastly, have mechanisms in place where students can communicate when they are feeling unsafe. This could also include when they just need a break, when they need a timeout, when they need a place to be able to just sit and possibly do some deep breathing exercises to help them. Have those things in place where they can utilize them. One of the best ways to alleviate behavior issues is to have strategies in place that implement predictability and consistency. So I talked about earlier rehearsing the expectations frequently. Discuss the rationale for the rules and the expectations and possible rewards so that they clearly understand them. Avoid threats, intimidation, and battles for control. And integrate safety and conflict resolution skills throughout the curriculum. de-escalation interventions are helpful and useful for the classroom teacher to use. And so as you look over some of these techniques, do them all together as a class so they become very familiar with them and it's safe. And then when they need to, draw back on these in a moment of conflict or when things just get escalated, they have practice with this. De-escalation techniques are important to have in place in the classroom, but they have to be practiced. They have to have a feeling of safety and acceptance in doing these techniques. So as you look through them, just keep in mind to practice counting backwards with a student, maybe as a small group. Practice deep breathing techniques. So when they need to draw upon them, they feel safe and they already know how to do it. Okay, this is a slide that is also talking about the importance of promoting consistency and predictability in your class. In a corrections environment, it's important to have trust. And that doesn't mean that a teacher necessarily trusts an inmate, but it's very important for an inmate to trust the teacher. That means be consistent so that they can predict how you are going to act. You're not going to be one way one day and another the other day. And for some of them and their backgrounds, you could be the first person that is consistent and predictable, and it's important role modeling also. In this slide, I'm just giving some practical suggestions that teachers can do to foster predictability. Let students know ahead of time what's going to happen. Put a clear, concise agenda up on the board. Implement classroom systems and procedures that can alleviate emotional stressors. This in itself will prevent some behavioral problems. Transitions can be a difficult time, so prepare students. We will come back together as a class in 5 minutes. Give them some time to make those transitions, and that helps. In this slide, it's a recap of some of the things that we've already discussed, psychological safety, and some characteristics of that for the student is clear expectations, a process for addressing behavioral concerns, and students understand that there are mechanisms in place that a student can communicate about experiences that might undermine feelings of safety. In this slide, I've given some questions for teachers as they reflect on what kind of a trauma-informed classroom environment they have. How are they feeling? What can they do to regulate themselves so that they can be prepared to teach? Have they set up clear expectations? What is the emotional tone of the classroom? Have I greeted my students by name? Have I had at least one positive interaction with a student today? And because we have adults in basic education classes, it's known that they have had academic failure their whole life. So interactions between teachers and themselves positive interactions probably did not happen at all or very often. So that is very important. Is there a student who might need extra attention or support today? I wanted to speak briefly, since we're talking about adults here, the concept of andragogy. It was theorized by Dr. Malcolm Knowles, and he stated that people become adults psychologically when they arrive at self-concept, being responsible for their lives, and becoming self-directed. And this is important as we go into the next group of slides in the integrative approach to working with the incarcerated population to keep the concept of andragogy in mind. The concept of integrative techniques really intrigued me as I do my work with the population of incarcerated individuals. And the main focus of my job has been empowering and equipping teachers to work with the incarcerated population, and ultimately the goal is academics, education, obtaining a GED, and possibly JC College credits that are available in institutions. But it really comes short, I believe, in the whole process of them being free in the world and somebody's neighbor someday. So they can obtain a GED, but if they haven't changed their mindset, if they're still doing criminal thinking behavior, if addiction tendencies are still there, violence, attachment problems, dysregulation, if those are not addressed, it really made me just have to think very hard about how the education system was serving them. The responsivity principle was drafted by researchers in Canada to reduce recidivism, and it was an empirically based treatment model that wanted to maximize an offender's ability to learn by rehabilitative intervention, which would provide cognitive treatment interventions that were tailored to the offender's learning style, abilities, strengths, and motivation. In order to have an integrative approach, collaboration needs to take place between multiple entities in an institution. In order to establish this multi-tiered service delivery system, schools need professional development for all the school staff, provision of expert consultative services, and direct clinical supports using evidence-based interventions. One of the empirically based trauma treatment approaches that I wanted to see integrated in the prison setting was cognitive processing therapy. This is a therapy where certain thoughts that are related to traumatic events can cause associated stress, but with CPT, clients learn to identify negative thoughts that make them feel at risk or re-traumatized, and learn to replace those thoughts with more accurate thoughts. And I really wanted to see an integration of this program in the schools, because even in the classroom setting, I can see ways that even, a teacher, not being a therapist, could introduce some of these concepts in the classroom. A graphic organizer, for example, what I used to believe, what I now believe. Things such as this. It can be discussions where they're identifying their beliefs. Is that really true? If ever there were a population that could benefit from changing dysfunctional thoughts and behaviors, it is our incarcerated population. Therapeutic models can at times have a pushback with teachers in their attitude being, I'm here to teach academics, not to be a therapist, not to concern myself with feelings. So I wanted to include growth mindset in this presentation because this is a concept that teachers are trained in and very familiar with. And when you read this slide, you will realize that it has its roots in cognitive processing therapy. Motivational interviewing is also a concept that teachers are familiar with, and it has been effective in working with offenders who may be ambivalent or not motivated to change. And the whole premise of motivational interviewing is it aims to increase engagement and collaboration between the offender and the correctional worker or teacher, and to be able to increase the offender's talk about change. The four fundamental processes of motivational interviewing are engagement, and teachers are very familiar with this term, and they are well versed in a student who is engaged is going to have greater learning outcomes. So motivational interviewing fosters that. Also increases focus, and in some of the previous slides, we talked about the trauma student has difficulty focusing. Evoking. This is the practitioner of motivational interviewing, which would be the teacher, is working to draw out the underlying motivation for the offender. Many times, this could be their release date. It could be learning to read so that they could be able to read to their children. It could be passing a certain class in prison that would make their family proud. Planning. This is when the student, the offender, is ready to change, and the practitioner, teacher, works together to make a plan for how that can happen. This is the behavioral change stairway model that was actually developed from law enforcement agencies in hostage situations. And they learned that in a situation where they were trying to talk to a hostage and get them to release their hostages and just to calm down, the first part was just listening, letting them talk. The second was empathy. Third, building the rapport, trust. And then creating influence. And lastly, behavioral change. And all of these provide an individual with the emotional support that they need as they help them learn to problem solve. Some challenges. The climate in prisons can be very inconsistent with motivational interviewing. It's very important to emphasize that motivational interviewing doesn't accept all behaviors, but rather just seeks to understand them. There is correctional research that motivation is indicated as an important factor that needs to be considered. And along with the correctional principle of responsivity, has fueled interest in motivational interventions, particularly motivational interviewing as an intervention method for offenders. Another tenet of my integrated approach to a trauma-informed classroom is dialectical behavior therapy. And this is a current trend among counselors working with offenders. It's meant to address behaviors as it teaches 4 skills: mindfulness, emotional regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. It's discussed in the research by Moore how use of DBT in prison settings helps offenders control impulses and tolerate difficult emotions. Moore and colleagues' research showed that after learning DBT skills, offenders were able to utilize more adaptive coping skills. On this slide, it goes into a little bit more detail on the tenets of DBT therapy: mindfulness, emotional regulation, distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness. And I can think of many ways that this can be utilized in the classroom. Journaling for mindfulness, role playing for interpersonal effectiveness and improving and maintaining relationships, group work, having to practice responding to each other in a positive way. All of those are building interpersonal relationships. Distress tolerance, incorporating a growth mindset in motivational interviewing when they come upon a task that is difficult for them. And a classroom is a great space to practice emotional regulation, especially with a trauma-informed teacher and a classroom that is set up for safety, acceptance, and all the things that we talked about previously. It's exciting to talk about the integrative approach of art therapy for the incarcerated, because there is already the art therapy in prisons program already funded, already in place. And I've been able to see firsthand some of the benefits of this program, although currently it's separate than the classroom. Although some classroom teachers do pull in some elements of art, but I would like it to be utilized in a way that would be for self-regulation, for being able to de-escalate a situation, also able to express themselves in a way that they might not be able to with the written word. So there's just a lot of components that help with a student being able. Art therapy is an integrated approach to trauma. The last component of my integrative approach is forgiveness and reconciliation. There is a program called the Charis Prison Ministry. Charis is an ancient Greek word that means right or opportune moment. And this ministry urges inmates to forgive others who they feel have harmed them. They are not encouraged to apologize and seek forgiveness from those they have wronged, as at the beginning stages, it might be too early for that. Many of them know little about Christianity, so the focus is on God's forgiveness of them for their sins and their need to forgive others who they hold in unforgiveness. The benefits of forgiveness is that it can open them up to introspection and trigger what Jones asserts as the process of letting go of one's own point of view concerning what happened. This letting go also allows a person to be open to how others feel and to see things from God's point of view. Many times, this is a difficult concept for inmates to have empathy and put themselves in somebody else's shoes. Practices of forgiveness help the offender be transformed into someone who shares in God's work. When the offender begins to understand things from the point of view of forgiveness, self-forgiveness also becomes possible. And according to David Myers, learning that God loves you as you are can form the psychological basis for a realistic self-worth. I have actually seen this take place in the lives of inmates, and it's powerful and it's transformative. I would be remiss to not talk about my experience with the Rwandan people in talking about forgiveness and reconciliation, especially in the justice system and with incarcerated individuals that I work with. It is worth a closer look at what they have done to heal in their country that we could learn from in our system here in the United States. According to Penelham, self-awareness can lead to repentance as one begs God to be freed from his or her own bad impulses. Through repentance, an inmate learns that his or her identity is linked with others, including victims and perpetrators. It's not about self-esteem, but rather about Jesus teaching that our own lives are bound up with our neighbors. Forgiveness that is not followed by change in behavior is, however, a rejection of God's grace. I've spent most of the presentation thus far talking about the need and indication for an integrative approach to trauma with the incarcerated in a school setting. But the contraindication of this approach is that it does involve a system-level change across an entire, not only prison system, but prison, with multiple entities that are currently not working in conjunction with each other. Would need to be a lot of time involved in identifying the needs of schools, reviewing strategies, funding for implementation. Professional development is also needed to understand how trauma impacts the classroom and to mobilize ongoing support to help create and sustain change. Furthermore, schools must review their staffing limitations and, when necessary, seek out collaborative relationships with available mental health professionals to best meet the needs of the school. Currently, collaboration between departments is at the beginning stage, with schedules and departments not overlapping. Further contraindications are that prisons are not primarily therapeutic environments. They prioritize security over health and rehabilitation needs. These potential effects could be limited by the prison setting itself. In conclusion, An integration of trauma-informed care needs to start with awareness and understanding first throughout the entire organization. Staff must meet 5 basic principles of trauma-informed care, which are safety, trust, empowerment, choice, and collaboration. The integrative approach to trauma in working with offenders helps them address their trauma and also, in conclusion, an integrative approach to trauma-informed practices in the correctional environment, which would include multi-empirically supported treatments for trauma, have a greater impact on the rehabilitative goals of inmates in the correctional environment than by just using one education or therapeutic technique. I wanted to mention some research challenges with inmate populations. Prisons have such high turnover rate, and participants are likely to be released or transferred unexpectedly with little notice. This creates research challenges. Some areas for further research and implications for the treatments that are offered in prisons. In-prison interventions might not be as effective if they are not linked with interventions that target the psychosocial needs of the individual once they're released. 2 therapeutic trials highlighted the importance of community aftercare to maintain the therapeutic gains delivered in prison. Lastly, psychological interventions that combine prison-based and community-based services should be prioritized for future research. Thank you so much.